All right, welcome back. Socrates had just finished explaining his overall allegory to Glaucon. And so we'll read through that one more time. What I'd like you to do is you're following through the next part of the video, and please make sure you're following along with the reading as we're reading it aloud, as I'm reading it aloud. Start to think about these overarching questions about living in the real world, and then these following analysis questions. Is this a successful strategy? Should he have done it a different way? What critiques can you find? Socrates says, "This entire allegory, I said, you may now append, dear Glaucon, to the previous argument. The prison house is the world of sight. The light of fire is the sun. And you will not misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upwards to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world, according to my poor belief, which, at your desire, I have expressed, whether rightly or wrongly, God knows. But whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all, and is seen with an effort, and when seen is also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual, and that this is the power upon which he who would act rationally, either in public or private life, must have his eyes fixed." So when you get up to that summit of all that you've learned, not just in school, but in your entire life, through your family, when you get up to that summit, the last thing you see is what the right thing is, what the good is. So we haven't quite gotten to what he means by this idea of the good, but we can relate it to this idea of the sun. He's thinking of it as the source of all life on earth, which the sun is. Without the sun, we wouldn't have photosynthesizing plants and so on and so forth. So we need the sun, and it's understood as a way that gives life, in much the same way that the good is the last thing that we understand, according to Socrates here, and it too is this kind of life-generating force. "I agree," Glaucon says, "as far as I am able to understand you. Moreover," Socrates says, "you must not wonder that those who attain to this beatific vision, this beautiful vision, are unwilling to descend to human affairs, for their souls are ever hastening into the upper world, where they desire to dwell, which desire of theirs is very natural if our allegory may be trusted." It's natural that they want to stay in this world of beauty and knowledge and so on. And Glaucon says, yes, it is very natural. "And is there anything surprising in one who passes from divine contemplations to the evil state of man, misbehaving himself in a ridiculous manner, if while his eyes are blinking and before he has become accustomed to the surrounding darkness, he is compelled to fight in courts of law or in other places about the images or the shadows of images of justice, and is endeavoring to meet the conceptions of those who have never yet seen absolute justice?" We'll get into why the courts are suddenly brought up here, but it's significant to Socrates' life. But he says, Glaucon says, "anything but surprising. Anyone who has common sense will remember that the bewilderments of the eyes are of two kinds and arise from two causes, either from coming out of the light or from going into the light, which is true of the mind's eye, quite as much of the bodily eye. And he who remembers this, when he sees anyone whose vision is perplexed and weak, will not be too ready to laugh. He will first ask whether the soul of man has come out of the brighter light and is unable to see because unaccustomed to the dark, or having turned from the darkness to the day, is dazzled by the excess of light. And he will count the one happy in his condition and state of being, and he will pity the other. Or if he have a mind to laugh at the soul which comes from below into the light, there will be more reason in this than in the laugh which greets him who returns from above to the light of the cave." So he's saying that when you come out of this cave of ignorance, the light from the real world is so blinding and disorienting that you can't see. Similarly, when you descend back into the cave, the darkness is so deep and impenetrable that for someone who's used to seeing in the bright lights, they can't see at all in the dim cave. So both situations require an adjustment in the way that you see. And you may laugh at someone or pity them depending on which situation they're in, though Socrates has a feeling that it may be wiser to have pride in the person who is coming out of the darkness for the first time into the light, because it's an ascent into the world of knowledge and of knowing, and then pity the person who's descending back down. But then he may flip on that later on. We'll have to see what happens here. That, he said, is a very just distinction. That's Glaucon speaking. But then, if I am right, certain professors of education must be wrong when they say that they can put knowledge into the soul which was not there before, like sight into blind eyes. So again, we're getting back to our main overarching essential questions. How do we learn about this real world? Can someone just teach it to you? In Socrates' opinion, no. You have to see it for yourself. You have to see the world for yourself in order to learn about it. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say as students, given that we're here discussing it and I'm your teacher. Am I not supposed to be putting knowledge into you? Or is it somehow exactly what Socrates is saying, is that you have to gain the knowledge for yourself? Because obviously I can't put knowledge into your head like I put money in a bank. Glaucon said, they undoubtedly say this, whereas our argument shows that the power and capacity of learning exists in the soul already, and that just as the eye was unable to turn from darkness to light without the whole body, so too the instrument of knowledge can only by the movement of the whole soul be turned from the world of becoming into the world of being. So it's this effort of the soul, it's this intense drive to learn. It reminds me a little bit of that idea that in order to master anything, it takes 10,000 hours. It's not just that you like flip and suddenly you can ball with LeBron James or swim with Michael Phelps. It's that you have to put in an enormous amount of effort even just to have the basics. And that's exactly what Socrates is saying here with regards to gaining knowledge. It's an effort of turning the soul into the world of knowledge. And you switch from the idea of becoming into being. So it's like, I'm becoming a great, pick your sport, skill, musical instrument, etc. I'm becoming that, now I'm being it. Well, I'm becoming an educated person, now I'm being an educated person. And the trend is always upward. And learn by degrees to endure the sight of being and of the brightest and best of being, or in other words, of the good. It's very true, Glaucon says. And must there not be some art which will effect conversion in the easiest and quickest manner, not implanting the faculty of sight, for that exists already, but has been turned in the wrong direction and is looking away from the truth? Yes, he said, such an art may be presumed. And whereas the other so-called virtues of the soul seem to be akin to bodily qualities, for even when they are not originally innate, they can be implanted later by habit and exercise, the wisdom, more than anything else, contains a divine element which always remains, and by this conversion is rendered useful and profitable, or, on the other hand, hurtful and useless. Did you never observe the narrow intelligence flashing from the keen eye of a clever rogue, how eager he is, how clearly his paltry soul sees the way to his end? He is the reverse of blind, but his keen eyesight is forced into a service of evil, and he is malicious, or he is mischievous, in proportion to his cleverness. So everyone possesses, in Socrates' view, this capacity for sight, for seeing, becoming, and then being. And if only people would aim their skills toward this, rather than, he uses the example of a rogue, which would be like a thief, a highway robber, rather than being that, they could well, they can move the entire population toward this idyllic ideal, this perfect, well, he called it the republic, this republic of perfection, or what we might call a utopia. Very true, Glaucon said. But what if there had been a circumcision of such natures in the days of their youth, and they had been severed from those sensual pleasures, such as eating and drinking, which, like leaden weights, were attached to them at their birth, and which dragged them down and turned the vision of their souls upon the things that are below? If, I say, they had been released from these impediments and turned in the opposite direction, the very same faculty in them would have seen the truth as keenly as they see what their eyes are turned to now. Very likely, Glaucon said. Yes, Socrates says, and there is another thing which is likely, or rather a necessary inference from what has preceded, that neither the uneducated and uninformed of the truth, nor yet those who never make an end of their education, will be ministers of the state. Not the former, because they have no single aim of duty, which is the rule of all actions, private as well as public, nor the latter, because they will not act at all except upon compulsion, fancying that they are already dwelling apart in the islands of the blessed. So that is to say, neither those people who are educated, nor those people who just can't stop living in the ivory tower of education should be allowed to be governors or statesmen, basically presidents, rulers of the republic, of the state. And he says, well, because if you're uninformed, what business do you have telling people how they should live their lives? Get out of here. If you can't stop, if you can't get out of this ivory tower, of this place of perpetual education, then you still have no business of telling people what to do, because you're not living their lives. So you'll be obsessed with the life that you're living, of constantly being in the state of being and in the presence of good. So they have no right to be rulers of the state either. And Glaucon says, very true. Socrates continues, then the business of us who are founders of the state will be to compel the best minds to attain that knowledge which we have already shown to be the greatest of all. They must continue to ascend until they arrive at the good. But then, when they have ascended and seen enough, we must not allow them to do as they do now. What do you mean? I mean that they remain in the upper world. But this must not be allowed. They must be made to descend again among the prisoners in the cave, and partake of their labors and honors, whether they are worth having or not. But is it not unjust? He said, ought we to give them a worse life, when they might have a better one? You have again forgotten, my friend, Socrates says, the intention of the legislator, who did not aim at making any one class in the state happy above the rest. The happiness was to be in the whole state, and he held the citizens together by persuasion and necessity, making them benefactors of the state, and therefore benefactors of one another. To this end, he created them, not to please themselves, but to be his instruments in binding up the state. So he's saying they have a service and a duty to do, to bind the state together into a cohesive unit, not to continue to think about themselves, but to think about the world in which they live, such that more people may have the opportunity to ascend to that good as benefactors of one another. True, Glaucon said, I had forgotten. Observe, Glaucon, that there will be no injustice in compelling our philosophers to have a care and providence of others. We shall explain to them that in other states, men of their class are not obliged to share in the toils of politics. And this is reasonable, for they grow up at their own sweet will, and the government would rather not have them. Being self-taught, they cannot be expected to show any gratitude for a culture which they have never received. But we have brought you into the world to be rulers of the hive, kings of yourself and of other citizens, and have educated you far better and more perfectly than they have been educated. And you are better able to share in the double duty. Wherefore each of you, when his turn comes, must go down to the general underground abode and get the habit of seeing in the dark. When you have acquired the habit, you will see 10,000 times better than the inhabitants of the cave. You will know what the several images are and what they represent, because you have seen the beautiful and just and good in their truth. And thus our state, which is also yours, will be a reality, and not a dream only, and will be administered in a spirit unlike that of other states, in which men fight with one another about shadows only, and are distracted in the struggle for power, which in their eyes is a great good. Whereas the truth is that the state in which the rulers are most reluctant to govern is always the best and most quietly governed, and the state in which they are most eager is the worst. In other words, long paragraph from Socrates. Gets a little preachy in this one. It's the responsibility of the philosophers to ascend to the good, to return, and then to lead. Pretty bold, okay? But it's the idea that they share in this responsibility because they don't want to govern for power. They want to govern for the responsibility of allowing more people the opportunity to ascend to the good. That's the idea there. It's based on the idea that when you have a state in which people are constantly struggling for greater power for themselves or for those that are just like them, then you have a tyranny. Then you have one person, at the worst, a Joseph Stalin or an Adolf Hitler, who tyrannizes every other person that's directly below them. Or you have a group of people that tyrannizes all the other groups of people. So, for example, in certain societies where one culture is the dominant culture, it suppresses all the other cultures that live there. Quite true, Glaucon says, continuing on. And will our pupils, when they hear this, refuse to take their tolls at the toils of state, when they are allowed to spend the greater part of their time with one another in the heavenly light? Impossible, Glaucon says. No one would ever not want to be a ruler. He answered, for they are just men, and the commands which we impose upon them are just. There can be no doubt that every one of them will take office as a stern necessity, and not after the fashion of our present rulers of state. Yes, my friend, Socrates says, and there lies the point. You must contrive for your future rulers another and a better life than that of a ruler. And then you may have a well-ordered state. For only in the state which offers this will they rule who are truly rich, not in silver and gold, but in virtue and wisdom, which are the true blessings of life. Whereas if they go to the administration of public affairs, poor and hungering after their own private advantage, thinking that hence they are to snatch the chief good, order there can never be. For they will be fighting about the office, and the civil and domestic broils which thus arise will be the ruin of the rulers themselves and of the whole state. Most true, Glaucon says. And the only life which looks down upon the life of political ambition is that of true philosophy. Do you know of any other? Indeed, I do not, says Glaucon. And those who govern ought not to be lovers of the task, for if they are, there will be rival lovers, and they will fight. There's no question. Who then are those whom we shall compel to be guardians? Surely they will be the men who are wisest about the affairs of state, and by whom the state is best administered, and who at the same time have other honors and another and a better life than that of politics? They are the men, and I will choose them, Glaucon says. And now shall we consider in what ways such guardians will be produced, and how they are to be brought from darkness into light, as some are said to have ascended from the world below to the gods. By all means, Glaucon replies. The process, I said, is not turning over of an oyster shell, but the turning round of a soul, passing from a day which is little better than night to the true day of being. That is, the ascent from below, which we affirm to be true philosophy. Quite so, Glaucon says. So, with that, we have the conclusion of the allegory of the cave. So, as you're going through, make sure you're answering these two questions. What do the different symbols represent in the allegory? What is the cave? Who are the prisoners? What's the sun? And so on and so forth. What meaning can you find in this combination of symbols? What's the meaning here? What is Socrates really driving at? And is the allegory mode effective at conveying this meaning? If it is, why? If it's not, why not? When we come into class, we'll be trying to broach these broader questions and trying to apply it to our lives. And so I'd love to hear what you're thinking. Please make sure you're taking notes so that you're ready to go in the discussion. I'm really looking forward to having it with you. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in class.